At my husband's 45th birthday party, he stood up, raised his glass, smiled at me, and said, "You know what's really funny? I slept with your best friend on our wedding night." The room went silent. I smiled, set my wineglass down, and quietly walked away. At midnight, my husband came home. The moment he opened the front door, he froze. A few seconds later, he collapsed to his knees. Most people probably assumed I walked out of that party because my heart had finally broken. The truth was much simpler. By the time Richard made that confession, my heart had already survived far worse than his words. I just hadn't told him that yet. His birthday dinner was held in the private banquet room of Willow Creek Country Club, one of those comfortable suburban places outside Columbus where retired couples played golf on weekday mornings and families celebrated graduations on weekends. Richard loved the attention the place brought him. He liked being recognized by the staff, shaking hands with members, acting like he'd built every success in his life with nothing but grit and charm. I had organized every detail. The navy and silver decorations, his favorite prime rib buffet, the chocolate bourbon cake from the bakery he'd loved since college, the slideshow that played quietly on 2 large screens filled with pictures from childhood, family vacations, company milestones, and birthdays that once seemed happy. 24 years of marriage fit surprisingly well into a 3-minute slideshow. Our daughter Hannah arrived early to help arrange centerpieces. "You okay, Mom?" she asked while straightening the table cards. I smiled. "Just tired." She hugged me. "You've done way too much for this party." "I wanted your dad to have a nice birthday." Even saying those words felt strangely distant, as though I were reading someone else's script. Luke came in carrying boxes of company-branded cookies one of Richard's suppliers had sent over. "Dad's already outside telling everyone how he closed another big project," he said with a laugh. That sounded exactly like Richard. He had become the kind of man who believed every room should orbit around him. Most people only knew that version. They didn't know about the paperwork I had quietly filed away, the meetings with attorneys, the nights I spent staring at bank statements that refused to make sense, or the signature on a $2 million loan that looked almost like mine. Except I had never signed it. Guests filled the room with easy conversation. Neighbors talked about grandchildren. Richard's employees discussed fishing trips and summer vacations. The servers poured wine while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Then Vanessa arrived. She had been my best friend since freshman year at Ohio State. She had stood beside me at my wedding, wearing lavender silk and crying happy tears. She had held Hannah the day she was born. She had brought casseroles when my father died. She smiled at me now. "You look beautiful, Ellie." "So do you." For half a second, our eyes met. She looked away first. That tiny moment told me more than 20 years of friendship ever had. Dinner ended. Coffee was poured. Someone clinked a fork against a glass. Richard stood, lifted his bourbon, and flashed the confident grin that had charmed clients for decades. "I've got a birthday toast." Everyone applauded. He looked directly at me. "You know what's really funny?" He chuckled. "I slept with your best friend on our wedding night." Silence swallowed the room. No one laughed. No one moved. Every face turned toward me. I slowly set my wineglass on the table. Then I smiled. Not because I forgave him. Not because I was in shock. Because after 6 months of waiting, Richard had just handed me exactly what my attorney said we could never force him to give us. He had told the truth. In front of everyone. The drive home should have taken 22 minutes. Instead, it felt suspended outside of time. I didn't cry. I didn't turn on the radio. I simply drove through the familiar streets of suburban Columbus, watching porch lights glow against the warm summer night while replaying Richard's words. Not because they hurt more now, but because I knew exactly what they had confirmed. At 11:54 p.m., my phone buzzed through the Bluetooth speakers. "Miriam?" My attorney never wasted words. "Are you somewhere private?" "I'm almost there." "Good. The investigators are already inside the house. They waited until Richard left the country club just as planned. You'll arrive first." I let out a slow breath. "So it's happening." "Yes, Ellie. You did everything exactly right." I thanked her, ended the call, and drove the final mile. The house looked strangely ordinary. The porch light was on. The flower baskets I'd planted in May still hung beside the front door. Only the unmarked SUVs parked discreetly along the curb hinted that our lives had permanently changed. A county sheriff's deputy greeted me before I reached the walkway. "Mrs. Bennett?" "Yes." He offered a respectful nod. "They're almost finished securing the office. You can wait inside if you'd like." Inside. That word landed differently now. For 24 years, this had been my home. Tonight, it felt more like evidence. The foyer was quiet except for muffled voices upstairs. 2 investigators carried sealed document boxes down the staircase, carefully labeling each one before placing it beside the dining room table. One of them smiled politely. "Evening, Mrs. Bennett." I recognized Special Investigator Daniel Harris from our meetings. "Did you find it?" "We found considerably more than we expected." That wasn't triumph in his voice. It was concern. A portable safe had already been opened in the kitchen. Inside were prepaid phones, external hard drives, folders stuffed with contracts, and several envelopes containing cashier's checks. Another investigator photographed everything before sealing each item into evidence bags. My eyes drifted toward Richard's home office. The desk where I'd once balanced payroll spreadsheets while Hannah colored beside me. The filing cabinet where Luke used to hide birthday presents he'd made in elementary school. So many ordinary family memories now shared space with forged documents and hidden accounts. Footsteps echoed from upstairs. Hannah came down first. Her mascara had smudged, but she was holding herself together. She wrapped her arms around me without saying a word. A moment later, Luke appeared. He looked confused more than angry. "Mom," he whispered, "is this real?" I touched his shoulder. "I'm afraid it is." "I don't understand." "I know." He looked toward the office where investigators continued cataloging evidence. "Dad said this was all some misunderstanding." I didn't answer immediately. Children, no matter how old they become, deserve honesty, but they also deserve time. "You'll know everything soon," I said softly. "Tonight isn't the night to explain it all." Just before midnight, headlights swept across the front windows. Richard was home. The front door swung open. He took one step inside, then stopped. His eyes moved from the sheriff's deputy to the investigators, to the evidence boxes lined neatly along the hallway. "What the hell is this?" No one answered immediately. Special Investigator Harris stepped forward and handed him a folder. "Richard Bennett, this is a court-authorized search warrant relating to an ongoing financial crimes investigation." Richard's face drained of color. This has to be some mistake." "It isn't." He looked at me for the first time. His expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. "Ellie..." I said nothing. His gaze fell to the small table beside the entryway. There, next to the warrant, rested my wedding ring. Beneath it lay a single handwritten note. "I protected you from your mistakes for 24 years. I will not protect you from your crimes anymore." He stared at those words. His knees buckled. And without another sound, he collapsed onto the hardwood floor. Richard stayed on the floor longer than anyone expected. Not because he couldn't stand. Because for the first time in our marriage, standing up wouldn't change the reality in front of him. Special Investigator Harris waited patiently until Richard finally pulled himself onto a nearby chair. "I want my attorney," Richard said, his voice unsteady. "You'll have every opportunity to contact counsel," Harris replied calmly. "Tonight we're executing a lawful search warrant. We'd appreciate your cooperation." Richard looked around the room as if someone might suddenly announce it was all a misunderstanding. Instead, another investigator walked past carrying his desktop computer. A second carried 2 banker's boxes filled with accounting files. A third photographed the locked cabinet behind his desk. The illusion that Richard controlled this house disappeared one piece of evidence at a time. His eyes settled on me. "You did this." I met his gaze without raising my voice. "No, Richard." A long pause stretched between us. "You did." For a moment, I almost recognized the man I'd married. Almost. Then his expression hardened. This is because of what I said tonight. No, you couldn't handle the truth. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. I handled it better than you expected. He opened his mouth to argue, but Harris interrupted. Mr. Bennett, we'd like to ask where the external backup drives are located. I don't know what you're talking about. One investigator quietly placed 3 identical backup drives on the dining room table. We already found them. Richard looked away. That tiny movement told me everything. He had spent years believing he was always the smartest person in the room. Tonight, he was discovering what happens when other people prepare longer than you do. Watching investigators move through the house pulled me backward through time. 24 years. That's how long Richard and I had been married. We met when we were both in our early 20s. I was finishing graduate school while working weekends at my father's property management office. Richard was ambitious, funny, and endlessly confident. He could make strangers laugh while waiting in line for coffee. My father liked him. He's got drive, Dad used to say. He just needs someone who keeps both feet on the ground. I smiled every time Dad said it. I can do that. For a long time, I believed I had. When we married, my father invested part of his retirement savings to help us start Bennett Residential Group. Richard became the face everyone saw. I became the person making sure the lights stayed on. I answered customer calls from our kitchen. Balanced payroll while Hannah napped in her high chair. Prepared invoices after Luke fell asleep on the living room rug. When Richard landed a contract, everyone congratulated him. When suppliers got paid on time, no one noticed. I never minded. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a competition. Or so I believed. As the years passed, Richard became increasingly successful. Bigger contracts. A nicer house. Country club membership. Luxury pickup trucks. Client dinners that lasted later and later. Whenever I questioned another missed anniversary or canceled weekend, he'd kiss my forehead. I'm doing this for us. I wanted to believe him. So I did. Vanessa believed him too. Or at least, that's what I thought. She had been my best friend since freshman year at Ohio State. She stood beside me as maid of honor. She held my bouquet during the ceremony. She cried when my father walked me down the aisle. She became Aunt Vanessa to Hannah and Luke. She never missed birthdays, Christmas dinners, graduations, or Sunday barbecues. Looking back now, I realized she'd never really left our lives. She'd simply found a different place inside them. The investigators continued carrying evidence toward the front door. I watched another sealed box disappear into an unmarked SUV. Inside that box were financial records. Outside, the neighbor's porch lights glowed quietly in the summer darkness. Neither scene felt as impossible as one memory suddenly returning to me. Our wedding night. Richard had disappeared for nearly an hour. He'd smiled when he came back. One of the guys had too much to drink, he'd said. I was helping him get home. I never questioned him. Why would I? I trusted both the man I had married and the woman standing beside me in every family photograph. Tonight, 24 years later, I finally understood that the first lie in our marriage hadn't begun with forged signatures or hidden bank accounts. It had begun before we even unpacked our honeymoon luggage, and I had spent more than 2 decades building a life on top of it. People often ask when a marriage truly begins to fall apart. For me, it wasn't the birthday confession. It wasn't even discovering the affair. It was the afternoon a loan officer called to congratulate me on financing a project I had never approved. That phone call came almost 6 months before Richard's birthday. I was folding laundry in the family room when my cell phone rang. Mrs. Bennett, this is Karen from Franklin Community Bank. We just wanted to confirm you've received the closing documents. I frowned. I'm sorry, what closing documents? There was a brief silence. The commercial loan package. I think you've reached the wrong person. She sounded confused. Our records show you signed everything last Thursday. My stomach tightened. I most certainly did not. Karen immediately apologized and promised to review the file. Less than an hour later, a courier delivered copies of the documents to our house. At first glance, the signature looked like mine. Close enough to fool a stranger. Not close enough to fool the woman who had been writing it for nearly 50 years. I stared at my own forged name for a long time. Then I quietly made a photocopy. When Richard came home that evening, I placed the papers beside his dinner plate. "Can you explain this?" He barely glanced at them. "Oh, that." "That?" "The bank made a mistake. My signature is on a $2 million loan. They mixed up some paperwork." I waited. He kept eating. "Richard," he sighed dramatically. "I'll call them tomorrow." "You didn't answer my question." He looked irritated now. "Ellie, not everything is a crisis." It was such an ordinary response that, for a moment, I almost believed him. Almost. But something inside me had shifted. Not because of the paperwork. Because my husband had shown absolutely no surprise. No concern. No curiosity. Only annoyance that I had noticed. That night, while he slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My father used to repeat the same sentence whenever he managed one of his rental properties. A mistake becomes a lie the moment someone refuses to explain it. By sunrise, I knew I wasn't dealing with a mistake. The following Tuesday, I drove downtown instead of going to the office. The law firm occupied the 4th floor of an old brick building overlooking the courthouse square. That's where I met Miriam Shaw. She greeted me with a warm handshake. "What brings you here today?" I slid the loan documents across her desk. "I think someone forged my signature." She didn't react dramatically. She simply adjusted her glasses and began reading. Several minutes passed. Then she looked up. "Mrs. Bennett?" "Please, Ellie." "Ellie, I don't think you should discuss this with anyone else until we understand exactly what we're looking at." That sentence chilled me more than anything she'd said before. Within 2 weeks, Miriam introduced me to Samuel Green, a forensic accountant who specialized in business fraud. He requested 5 years of financial records. I secretly downloaded copies from the company server while Richard attended what he called client dinners. Every evening I smiled, cooked dinner, asked about his day, and listened to stories that I would later learn were almost entirely fabricated. Every morning I met with Samuel. At first, he believed we would find sloppy bookkeeping. Instead, he found patterns. Invoices that didn't match projects. Payments made twice. Consulting fees paid to a company called Cole Strategic Solutions. Cole? Vanessa's last name. Samuel circled the entries with a red pen. "Do you know the owner?" I answered without thinking. "She's my best friend." He slowly removed his glasses. "I wish I had better news." He turned the monitor toward me. Over 7 years, nearly $1.8 million had flowed into Vanessa's company through contracts that appeared to provide almost no legitimate services. I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't understand the numbers. Because I suddenly remembered every girls' weekend she canceled. Every conference Richard supposedly attended. Every family dinner where they laughed at jokes I hadn't heard. The affair wasn't just hidden inside my marriage. It had been hidden inside my everyday life. When I finally found my voice, I asked Samuel one question. "Can we prove it?" He looked me directly in the eye. "If the records continue looking like this..." He paused. "We won't have to guess." Samuel's words echoed in my mind for days. "We won't have to guess." I had spent months wondering whether I was losing my imagination or finally finding my courage. The records answered that question. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was simply waiting for enough pieces to fit together. Over the following weeks, my life divided into 2 completely different worlds. By day, I met quietly with Miriam and Samuel. We reviewed spreadsheets, contracts, bank transfers, and property records. Every meeting uncovered another thread connecting Richard to money that had disappeared from company accounts. By evening, I went home, cooked dinner, watered the flowers, folded laundry, and listened while Richard talked about projects that supposedly kept him working late. The strangest part wasn't hearing him lie. It was realizing how effortlessly he'd learned to do it. One Tuesday evening, he walked through the back door carrying takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. "I figured you deserved a night off." He kissed my forehead. For just a heartbeat, muscle memory almost fooled me into believing everything was normal. Then I noticed the receipt sticking out of the bag. Dinner had been purchased nearly 2 hours earlier. It was stone cold. He hadn't been working late. He'd simply been somewhere else before deciding to bring home flowers and pasta as camouflage. I smiled anyway. Thank you. That smile wasn't forgiveness. It was patience. The investigation needed time. So did I. A few days later, Samuel called. I think you should come in. His office overlooked a busy intersection downtown. Cars moved steadily beneath the windows while he spread several documents across the conference table. I've been tracing the consulting payments. He pointed to a series of invoices. They're fake. I figured that much. It gets worse. He slid another folder toward me. The signatures approving those payments all belonged to Richard. The company receiving them belonged to Vanessa. And most of the supposed consulting projects never existed. I stared at the paperwork until the lines blurred together. So they've been stealing from the company? Yes. For how long? Samuel hesitated. About 7 years. 7 years. Long enough for Hannah to finish college. Long enough for Luke to become an adult. Long enough for Richard and Vanessa to attend countless birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, graduation parties, and Sunday cookouts while quietly moving money behind everyone's backs. I thought discovering the affair would be the worst pain imaginable. It wasn't. The affair explained betrayal. The financial fraud explained character. One was about broken vows. The other was about broken integrity. Miriam joined us a few minutes later carrying another file. We've also confirmed something important. She opened an old investment agreement signed by my late father. I know Richard presents himself as sole owner. She smiled faintly. He isn't. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Your father insisted on protective language when he invested the startup capital. She tapped one paragraph. You own 51% of Bennett Residential Group. I blinked. What? Richard has operational control. She paused. But legally, you've always owned the majority. I sat back in my chair, suddenly remembering an argument my father and Richard had shared shortly before our wedding. At the time, I assumed they were discussing taxes. Now I realized Dad had been protecting me. Even after his death. He still was. As the investigation expanded, state financial crimes investigators asked me a difficult question. Will Richard become suspicious if your behavior changes? I don't think so. Do you have any major family events coming up? I almost laughed. His birthday. When? 6 weeks. The lead investigator exchanged a glance with Miriam. Don't cancel it. I frowned. You want me to throw him a birthday party? We'd prefer everything appear completely normal. Driving home that afternoon, I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. Planning a celebration for the man who had betrayed me and possibly stolen from the people who trusted him felt almost unbearable. Then I remembered the frightened faces of employees whose retirement accounts Samuel believed had been quietly drained. Frank, our foreman, who had worked with us since the company's first year. Maria in payroll. Kevin in maintenance. They weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were families. If pretending everything was normal for 6 more weeks meant protecting them, I could do it. That evening, Richard looked up from the television. So, any ideas for my birthday? I smiled. Oh, I have a few. He grinned, completely unaware that every decoration, every invitation, every carefully planned detail was leading him toward the one celebration he would never forget. Not because it honored his life, because it marked the beginning of the truth. Planning Richard's birthday party became the strangest performance of my life. Every morning I answered emails from caterers. Every afternoon I approved flower arrangements. Every evening I smiled across the dinner table from the man whose life was quietly unraveling. While he had absolutely no idea, I already knew more than he could imagine. He mistook my calm for ignorance. That was his greatest mistake. One Saturday morning, he walked into the kitchen carrying a mug of coffee. So, he said casually, I was thinking maybe we should invite some of the bigger clients. I already have. He smiled. I knew I married the right woman. The words almost made me laugh. Not because they were funny, because they were 24 years too late. After he left for the office, I called Miriam. He suspects nothing. Good, she replied. The investigators are almost finished. They're verifying the last series of transfers. How much? There was a pause. More than we originally believed. I closed my eyes. I didn't think that was possible. Neither did we. A few days later, Samuel invited me downtown again. This time, the conference room felt unusually quiet. No spreadsheets covered the table. Only a laptop. I want you to hear something. He clicked play. A recorded phone call filled the room. Richard's voice. Vanessa's voice. The recording came from investigators after obtaining the proper legal authorization during the financial investigation. I can't keep moving money forever, Vanessa said. You won't have to, Richard answered. My birthday's next month. So? After that, I'm done pretending. There was a short silence. Then Richard laughed. I'll tell Ellie everything. My heart pounded. Vanessa sounded startled. Are you serious? Why not? You think she'll just let you walk away? It won't matter. Another laugh. Once she loses her temper, she'll look unstable. He sounded completely certain. I'll file for divorce. And the company? Already handled. He lowered his voice. Most of the assets are protected. What about Ellie? She'll get whatever's left. The recording ended. No one spoke. Finally, I managed one question. So, Samuel nodded slowly. Yes. The confession wasn't going to be spontaneous. No. It was planned. Miriam folded her hands. We believe he intended to humiliate you publicly, so everyone would remember my reaction. Exactly. She leaned forward. If you had screamed, thrown something, struck him, he could argue I was emotionally unstable, which would strengthen his position during the divorce. Everything suddenly fit together. The expensive birthday party, the large guest list, his insistence that employees, clients, neighbors, and family all attend. Richard wasn't planning a celebration. He was building an audience. Driving home, I felt strangely peaceful. For months, I'd wondered why he had become increasingly cruel. Now I understood. He wasn't growing careless. He believed he had already won. That evening, Hannah stopped by unexpectedly. She carried blueberry muffins she'd baked for church the next morning. You've been quiet lately, Mom. I've had a lot on my mind. She studied my face. Is everything okay with you and Dad? I wanted so badly to tell her everything. Instead, I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I promise you'll know the truth soon. She smiled uncertainly. I trust you. After she left, I stood alone on the back patio. Fireflies drifted across the yard. The maple tree Richard and I planted after Luke was born swayed gently in the warm Ohio breeze. For years, I'd believed revenge meant making someone hurt as much as they'd hurt you. Now I understood something different. Real justice wasn't built on anger. It was built on truth. Truth that could be proven. Truth that innocent people could rely on. Truth that didn't disappear the moment emotions settled. The birthday party was only 2 weeks away. Richard thought he was preparing to end our marriage on his own terms. Vanessa believed they would soon leave Ohio together, sell the company, and start over somewhere warm, spending money they had quietly stolen from the business my father had helped build. Neither of them realized that every transfer had been documented. Every forged signature had been preserved. Every lie had been carefully recorded. They believed they were writing the final chapter. What they didn't know was that they had already become characters in mine. The morning after Richard collapsed in our foyer, I barely slept. Not because I regretted what had happened, because I knew the hardest conversation was still ahead of me. It wasn't with investigators or lawyers. It was with Hannah and Luke. I texted both of them early that morning. Can we have breakfast together? Just us. Same diner, 9 o'clock. Neither asked why. They already knew enough to understand it mattered. The Maple Street diner hadn't changed in 20 years. The booths were still covered in worn red vinyl. The waitress still called everyone honey. The coffee was always a little too strong, and the pancakes were always too large. We had celebrated birthdays there, reported cards, college acceptance letters, Little League victories. It felt like neutral ground. Hannah arrived first. She hugged me tightly before sliding into the booth. "You didn't sleep, did you?" I smiled faintly. "Neither did you." A minute later, Luke walked in. He looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot and he'd forgotten to shave. He sat down without saying a word. The waitress poured coffee. Nobody touched it. Finally, Hannah broke the silence. "Mom." She swallowed hard. "Please don't protect us anymore." That sentence almost broke me. For so many years, protecting my children had become second nature. I softened bad news. I explained away Richard's absences. I convinced myself they deserved a peaceful childhood, even if it meant carrying uncomfortable truths alone. But they weren't children anymore. They deserved honesty. So I gave it to them. I learned about the forged loan 6 months ago. Luke frowned. "What loan?" I explained everything from the beginning. The phone call from the bank, the forged signature, meeting Miriam, hiring Samuel, and discovering the missing money. Neither interrupted. Then I told them about Vanessa, about the fake consulting company, about the affair, about their father's plan to publicly humiliate me before filing for divorce. Hannah quietly covered her mouth. Luke stared at the tabletop. "No," he whispered. "There's more." I nodded. "I'm afraid there is." When I finished, silence settled over the booth. Not angry silence. The kind that comes when someone's understanding of their entire life shifts all at once. Luke finally looked up. "My whole life." He rubbed both hands across his face. "I wanted to be Dad." My heart ached for him. "You wanted to be the man you believed he was. What's the difference?" "A very important one." He looked at me with the same uncertain expression he'd worn as a little boy after falling off his bicycle. "I don't even know what to believe anymore." I reached across the table. "You don't have to decide today." He lowered his head. "I keep thinking maybe there's some explanation. I hoped for one too." "There isn't?" I slowly shook my head. "No." Hannah spoke next. "What happens to the company?" That question reminded me why I had fought so hard to keep my emotions under control. "This isn't just about our family anymore." I explained what Samuel had uncovered regarding the employee retirement funds and the fraudulent contracts. "There are people who've worked there for decades," I said. "Families who trusted your father." Luke looked stunned. "Frank?" "Yes." "Maria?" "Yes." He leaned back heavily. "They don't deserve this." "No? They didn't do anything wrong." "Exactly." For the first time that morning, I saw something change in both of my children. Their pain remained, but it was joined by perspective. This wasn't only about betrayal inside our family. It was about innocent people whose livelihoods had been placed at risk. Hannah reached for my hand. "You could have exposed Dad months ago." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" "Because I wanted the truth to be complete." Luke frowned. "So nobody could say you made it up." "Exactly." The waitress returned with fresh coffee. This time, all 3 of us took a sip. The warmth steadied something inside me. As we prepared to leave, Luke stopped beside the booth. "I don't know what happens next." "Neither do I. But I know one thing." He looked directly at me. "I'm done confusing loyalty with silence." I nodded, feeling tears threaten for the first time since the birthday party. That wasn't the sound of my family falling apart. It was the sound of 2 good people deciding they would not inherit their father's excuses. The legal process moved much slower than anger. Television dramas make justice look dramatic. One surprise witness, one brilliant speech, one guilty verdict before the next commercial break. Real life looked different. It looked like conference rooms with stale coffee. Stacks of financial records. Long afternoons answering the same questions 3 different ways. It looked like patience. 2 weeks after breakfast with Hannah and Luke, the county court granted a temporary order placing the day-to-day management of Bennett Residential Group under my authority while the financial investigation continued. Walking back into the office felt stranger than walking out of my own house. The reception desk was exactly where I'd left it. The framed photographs of completed renovations still lined the hallway. The smell of fresh sawdust drifted in from the warehouse. Everything looked familiar. Nothing felt the same. Frank Morales was waiting outside my office. He had worked with us since Richard renovated his very first kitchen nearly 20 years earlier. His hands were rough from decades of construction work, and he'd always spoken only when he had something worth saying. "I've been meaning to tell you something." I invited him inside. He remained standing. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I believed Richard." He looked embarrassed. "He always acted like you handled paperwork while he built the company." I smiled sadly. "I did handle paperwork. You handled everything." He shook his head. "I remember you sitting in this office with baby Hannah asleep in a carrier beside your desk while you were cutting payroll checks." A small laugh escaped him. "You used to answer customer calls with one hand and feed Luke with the other." I'd forgotten he had seen those days. "I should have thanked you a long time ago," he continued quietly. "Instead, I let Richard convince all of us he built this place by himself." Emotion tightened my throat. "You don't owe me anything, Frank." "Yes, I do." He smiled. "You didn't help build this company." He paused. "You held it together." After he left, I closed my office door. For the first time since Richard's birthday, I cried. Not because of Richard. Because someone had finally seen the years I thought had disappeared unnoticed. The rebuilding began immediately. Samuel worked beside our controller to separate legitimate business expenses from fraudulent transfers. Every questionable payment was documented. Every employee retirement account was reviewed. Some losses were painful, but they weren't irreversible. I gathered everyone in the warehouse on Friday afternoon. Carpenters, office staff, project managers, receptionists, faces I'd known for years. Many looked frightened. Some looked angry. "I won't promise this will be easy," I began. "But I can promise you something." The room became perfectly still. "We're going to tell the truth." I explained only what I legally could. An investigation was underway. The company would continue operating. Payroll would be protected. Every decision from that day forward would be documented and transparent. When I finished, no one applauded. Instead, Maria from payroll quietly raised her hand. "My husband asked me something this morning." "What did he ask?" "He asked if we should start looking for another job." The room waited for my answer. If I believed this company couldn't survive honestly, I looked around at the people who had spent years building kitchens, repairing roofs, and helping families rebuild their homes. I wouldn't be standing here. A slow nod passed through the crowd. Hope didn't arrive all at once. But neither did fear leave all at once. Trust, I'd learned, returns the same way it's earned. One honest decision at a time. That evening, as I locked the office, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a number I knew by heart. Vanessa. I stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. A moment later, a voicemail notification appeared. I didn't play it. Not yet. Some conversations deserve to wait until you're strong enough to hear them without losing your peace. And for the first time in a very long time, I finally was. 3 months after Richard's birthday, I walked into the Franklin County Courthouse carrying nothing more than a leather folder and a cup of coffee. I used to believe courtrooms were places where people won or lost. Now I understood they were places where facts finally had a chance to breathe. The hearing that morning wasn't the criminal trial, that would come later. This was one of the final hearings in our divorce and the civil case concerning ownership of Bennett Residential Group. Richard sat across the room beside his attorney. He looked older than he had only a few months earlier. The expensive tailored suits were gone, replaced by a plain navy jacket that seemed just a little too large. His confidence hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer filled the room the way it once had. When our eyes met, he looked away first. That, more than anything else, told me how much had changed. The judge reviewed document after document. Investment agreements, corporate records, property deeds, bank statements. Then came the document my father had insisted upon nearly 25 years earlier. Miriam stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, this investment agreement establishes Mrs. Bennett as the majority owner of Bennett Residential Group from its inception. Richard's attorney objected. He operated the company for decades. Operational authority, Miriam replied calmly, is not the same as ownership. The retired attorney who had drafted the agreement years earlier testified by video. Despite his age, his memory remained remarkably sharp. I remember Mr. Bennett asking why my client needed majority protection, he said. And what did you tell him? The judge asked. I told him her father was investing his life's savings. He wanted to ensure his daughter could never be pushed out of the business she helped create. I felt tears threaten, but I held them back. Even after all these years, Dad was still keeping his promise. The judge ruled that my ownership interest was valid and enforceable. Richard lowered his head. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting. Just the quiet sound of another illusion coming to an end. Later that afternoon, the criminal case reached its conclusion. Richard accepted a plea agreement rather than face a lengthy trial. He admitted responsibility for bank fraud, identity theft involving my forged signatures, and the misuse of employee retirement funds. Vanessa entered a separate plea, accepting responsibility for the fraudulent consulting invoices and agreeing to cooperate fully with restitution. Neither escaped the consequences. Neither was destroyed for the sake of revenge. They were simply held accountable for choices they had made repeatedly over many years. Before sentencing, the judge allowed victims to speak. I stood behind the podium and unfolded a single sheet of paper. I didn't mention the affair. That betrayal belonged to my heart. The courtroom was there to hear about something larger. My husband didn't only betray his family, I began. He betrayed people who trusted him with their livelihoods. I glanced toward the gallery where Frank, Maria, and several long-time employees sat quietly. These men and women worked honestly every day. They believed their retirement savings were being protected. They believed their signatures mattered. They believed integrity still meant something. I paused. So did I. The room remained silent. I don't stand here asking for revenge. I stand here asking for accountability, because without accountability, honest people pay for dishonest choices they never made. When I returned to my seat, Hannah reached over and squeezed my hand. Luke did the same. For the first time since that birthday party, I realized I no longer needed Richard to admit what he had done. The evidence had spoken. The law had spoken. Most importantly, my own silence had finally been replaced by truth. As we walked out of the courthouse together, reporters called my name. One asked the question I had expected all along. Mrs. Bennett, do you feel like you've won? I stopped for a moment before answering. No. I smiled gently. Winning would have been growing old with the man I thought I married. I looked toward Hannah and Luke. What I feel today isn't victory. It's freedom. A year after Richard's birthday party, I found myself standing in the exact same ballroom at Willow Creek Country Club. The room looked almost identical. The chandeliers still reflected warm light across the polished floor. The windows still overlooked the golf course where the leaves were beginning to turn gold. The only difference was the reason everyone had gathered. This time, no one had come to celebrate one man's ego. They had come to celebrate dozens of ordinary people whose hard work had kept a company alive. Bennett Residential Group had just completed its most successful year in nearly a decade. Not because we had taken bigger risks. Because we had finally become the honest company my father had always envisioned. Every employee retirement account had been restored. The stolen funds had been recovered through restitution, insurance, and the sale of assets ordered by the court. It had taken months of work. Some days it had seemed impossible. But impossible things become manageable when enough decent people refuse to quit.